topped by few artists of his era. A star of stage, screen, radio, and concert hall.
But Old Man River, he
was also a forerunner in the battle for human rights and dignity. Over the years, Robeson would be both praised and damned for his devotion to this struggle. But it was his choice, and for it, he paid a heavy price.
Hold that barge, lift that veil, get a little drunk, and you land in jail. I get weary and sick of trying. I'm tired of living and scared of dying. But Old Man River, he just keeps rolling along. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We're soldiers of the cross.
Paul Robeson once said to me, he said, Harry, get them to sing your song, meaning the world, people. Get them to sing your song, and they will want to know who you are.
I was born of a slave father in a white civilization.
Reverend Robeson, Reverend Drew Robeson, was minister at Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, which was also called the First Presbyterian Church for Colored.
Throughout his life, he preached and encouraged his parishioners and his townsfolk to have race pride, which was almost a foreign concept.
Reverend Robeson was his people's voice within a community that preferred its African Americans to remain silent.
Remember, this church is not a black church. They have some black people coming here, majority of them, but the church itself is run by the white people, and they tell the church what to do.
Paul was 6 when his mother died, as he felt the traumatic event of her death and the terrible way that she died. She was burnt to death in a house. This experience blocked out all knowledge of his mother.
Paul is 10 when his family moves to nearby Somerville, a town with a reputation for racial tolerance. His father is named pastor of St. Thomas AME Zion Church.
Every Sunday morning, it would be a rolling out of a great sermon, and now we bow down on bended knee, oh Lord. And it became like an opera almost.
He believed in God. He was a Christian. And he is also one who can sing the great hymns of the church, the traditional spirits of the church, and it's not just for commercialism to make a living, it grows out of his soul.
The first time he realized that he was a baritone, that happened here in Somerville. The first time that he realized that he had great acting ability, that happened as a student in high school. He saw the possibility of the greatness that he would assume.
His father bred into him a strong self-esteem. He told him that he was as good as any white man, and there was nothing that he couldn't do if he set his sights on him.
In his senior year, he takes a competitive statewide examination and wins a full scholarship to Rutgers.
Robeson of Rutgers. I didn't know his first name. I didn't know that Rutgers was a university. It was just a phrase. Greatest football player in America. That's what I knew about him as a kid.
So I come to the school, and some of the other players are much older than I. And I'm a Negro, and they don't want a Negro on the team. And so one day I'm out on the field, and before you know it, one fellow hits me in the nose, and my nose is bleeding and bloody. And another fellow breaks my shoulder. And then I was on the ground, and a fellow steps on me like that. And I'm completely bloody.
His father's the one who told him to go back. And so he went back out after he kind of got himself together. Remember, he went to Rutgers. He was the only black person on campus. His father told him that if you quit, there are hundreds of Negro boys who will not get the opportunity to play, and the next practice, same thing.
And I was on the ground, and the man steps on my fingers and takes my nails off of my hand, and they're bleeding. And I become absolutely out of my mind. Sumashitsi. And the man comes by, and I'm about to tackle him, and I take him, and I'm gonna, as far as I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna kill him.
And the coach blew the whistle and said, okay, Rose, you made the team.
They knew forever that if they ever touched me, ever touched this Negro, that would be their lives. No more trouble from then on. I made the team.
They said of him that he was one of the smartest football players who ever played. In a sense, football was a metaphor for the way he dealt with conflict. Obviously, playing in his time, a black football player, you had to be impeccable. He never got penalized. You can't be rash. You have to be smart. You can't let anger or fear take over.
He earns 14 varsity letters and an All-American citation for football. He sings in the Glee Club, though he is not permitted to accompany them to out-of-town concerts. Racism limits Paul's on-campus social life, but he is popular with African-American students from neighboring colleges. Paul performs brilliantly on and off the athletic fields. His father's expectations are realized when, in his junior year, Paul is inducted into Phi Beta Kappa.
He was teaching me to be an orator. He died in 1918 in university at Rutgers, where I went, University of New Jersey and Rutgers. The proudest moments of his life were when I won many of their rhetorical contests. They have one every year. I had the honor of winning it for 4 years straight. And my third year, which was the most important, he was lying in state in Somerville, 15 miles away. And before he died, he told me that he wanted me to take part in the competition. I won it.
I would say his father, from what I could glean, was a wonderful man in many ways, but a little bit emotionally distant, a little even harsh. And the fact that his father died when Dad was only 20, it was a terrible blow. One, he lost an anchor, but two, he hadn't come to resolution with his father.
Moving to New York to attend Columbia University Law School, Paul immediately heads for Harlem, now the center of a renowned cultural renaissance.
By the time he arrived in Harlem, he was a hero. He was known for this extraordinary record that he had compiled at Rutgers. Twice an All-American football player, a dozen varsity letters, also a distinguished scholar at Rutgers. He already stood out, so his arrival at Harlem was instantly noted.
I don't think he had decided, and he said as much, that he hadn't decided what he wanted to be until perhaps his last year in college, when he had to make up his mind. I mean, he decided he didn't want to be a minister like his father wanted him to be. So he said, okay, I'll do law. Not because he had any great love for the law. And as things turned out, he never did.
After he got his law degree and was hired by a white firm, one white secretary, he called her in the office and said he needed for her to take down some dictation. And she said, I don't take dictation from niggers.
Fact is, the employer did even suggest that he might open up a branch in Harlem and put Paul in charge of it.
But he told Paul that none of the firm's white clients would really allow him to represent them in court. And he wasn't interested in joining a profession in which he couldn't reach the highest rungs.
Paul first appears on stage in amateur productions in Harlem. About this time, he meets Eslander Cardozo Good.
It certainly wasn't love at first sight or anything like that. My mother was a Renaissance woman, won a scholarship to Illinois at 15 in chemistry, wanted to be a doctor, went to Columbia Medical School. She could keep up with him intellectually, she could talk about anything.
It was her idea. She made no bones about that. She decided, this man for me.
And she decided that the mission on her part of helping him reach his maximum potential outweighed whatever she could do in her lifetime. And there was partly an element of ambition, call it opportunism if you will. In a sense, it would be fair to say he married Mother, partly on the rebound because Jerry Neal turned him down. She was a young woman from Trenton, whom Dad met when he was a freshman in college, and was really his first love, without a doubt.
The new Mrs. Robeson wastes no time in taking over the management of her husband's career. In 1922, he makes his Broadway debut in Taboo. Although the drama flops in New York and again on an English tour, critics recognize Robeson as a potential star. On his return from England, Paul appears on Broadway in the musical Shuffle Along, and occasionally in local concerts.
Lazy bones, sleeping in the sun. How you expect to get your day's work done?
In the 1920s, like so many other black intellectuals, Paul believed that if individual blacks would distinguish themselves in a variety of fields, whether it be sports or music or theater or film, they would thereby demonstrate that blacks were capable of doing anything as well as any white. In other words, art would prove the solvent for racism.
In 1924, Paul is cast in the lead role of the Provincetown Playhouse production of Eugene O'Neill's All God's Children Got Wings. The play's theme of interracial love provokes bomb and assassination threats.
The Provincetown Theater was a collection of nonconformists. There were all kinds of radicals, socialists, anarchists, communists. That was what Greenwich Village was, the bohemians there.
When Chillin is temporarily postponed, Robeson opens in a revival of O'Neill's The Emperor Jones. Paul's performances in both plays are widely praised. While in England with Taboo, Robeson meets the black American pianist and arranger, Lawrence Brown.
His meeting with Larry Brown, who was his accompanist for 30 years, was in 1922 in London, and by 1925, they really made a partnership.
Just at the Battle of Jericho, Jericho, yes, the whole battle at the Battle of Jericho, and the wolf come tumbling down. You may talk about the King of Gideon.
Lawrence Brown's idea was, he's got pride, and he wants to take his music, he wants to take our people's music, and present it as classic.
He was a gay man. He had lots of friends, but he didn't like necessarily being constantly in the public eye.
Their first RCA Victor recording quickly sells 50,000 copies.
Dad was torn between the purity of his art and reaching a mass audience. Mother argued you got to do some of the garbage, if you want to call it that, if you're going to reach a mass audience. You do that with radio, you do that with vaudeville, you do that with musicals. He recorded all kinds of popular songs. By popular songs, he did plantation songs, yeah. Old Black Joe, Old Folks at Home. He was a popular artist. He was maybe the third most popular radio artist in the United States for a couple of years in the late 20s, early 30s. I have to confess that as a little kid, my favorite song was not Deep River or anything like that. It was Mammy's Little Baby Loves Shortening Bread.
Mammy's little baby loves shortening bread.
He makes a critical decision in 1925 to do something that had never been done before, and that is to do whole programs of concert music consisting entirely of slave music. Whole programs, and he does this for 5 years. Though he's Phi Beta Kappa and linguist and All-American football player, Robeson does not recoil from Negro spirituals as middle-class blacks were doing at that time. Because when they heard them, a whole flood of memories entered their consciousness that caused a certain embarrassment on their part.
I'm gonna tell God all of my troubles when I get home.
did very consciously was to go into that world of black life, black art, extract from it those songs that he felt most comfortable with, and he felt were the ones that most demonstrated our history, our struggle, and our dignity as a people.
I explained the spirituals, that these were not songs of defeat, that they had come out of the struggles of the Negro people, that these were songs that aided the Negro people in their struggle.
Robeson took dialect to the concert stage. He didn't clean it up, but taking it and elevating it in the eyes of the listener, rather in the ear of the listener.
Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel? And why not every man?
He began to incorporate folk songs into his concert performances, particularly British folk songs, English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh songs, as well as other songs from other countries.
And over the waves, under the fountains and under the graves, under floods that are deepest, which Neptune obey, over rocks that are steepest, love will find out the way. Very nice idea, as a matter of fact.
Very nice
So the idea of my concert is one suggestion that all men are brothers because of their music. And in my first group, I do an old English song. I do an old song from about the 11th or 12th century from Czechoslovakia. The Moravian chorales of about the 11th and 12th centuries preceded the chorales upon which Johann Sebastian Bach based his music. So I take this, and then I do a Bach chorale, and then I create a slight confusion by doing a Negro spiritual right in the middle, because it belongs there. And I found that out by going back to Africa. For example, there was an old, in East Africa, there is a chorale form that reached a form just pre-Bach in Europe. Very interesting. Chabala chapataye, chabala pataye, chabala patapataye, chabala pataye, mzungu mzungu wachine, mzungu mzungu wachine. Swati Vatsklavă, vive česky zemlje. The first was African, almost, and you say they're very similar. The first was African, the second is from the 11th century in Czechoslovakia with a chorale that just preceded Bach.
Early in 1928, Robeson brings down the house with Old Man River in the London production of Showboat. He does not yet challenge the racist lyrics of the song that will follow him all his life.
Niggas all work on the Mississippi.
By 1930, his concerts, records, and radio appearances have made Paul a star on both sides of the Atlantic. The Robesons enjoy their status as the darlings of London's high society.
Don't look up and don't look down. You don't dare make the white boss frown.
Singing and appearing in London, he got to know all the upper crust people, the top people.
Pull that rope on the tail, you're dead.
But he also began to come into contact with some of the, I suppose, left-wing thinkers and intellectuals of the day, H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and others.
Paul and Darcy find Great Britain relatively free from the most blatant forms of American racism. But for most people of color, England is hardly paradise.
There were advertisements in the newsagent windows. No blacks, no Irish, no dogs.
Even the Robesons are not completely immune to English racism, and despite their social prominence, are refused service in London's swank Savoy Grill.
There was a colour bar. Racism was legal. Black people could be barred from hotels, from accommodation, from any public places. He met Africans here of all kinds, both students and Africans who were seamen or who worked in some capacity or another. And he learned from them, from the things that they told him about the anti-colonial struggle in their own countries, not just in Africa, but in the Caribbean and also in India, so that's very important. People like Jomo Kenyatta, who he would have met probably from the early 1920s here. Somebody like Nnamdi Azikiwe, who later became president of Nigeria. Somebody like Kwame Nkrumah, who became the first leader of independent Ghana.
He said once, I think it was only when he was in Britain he discovered he was an African.
England was a wonderful place in which to pursue the study of Africa. You couldn't pursue it anywhere in America at that time. You had the London School of Oriental Languages, where you could go and study African languages, Asian languages. But there's no question but that he was fluent, and in many different languages. How many he knew is a matter of controversy. Some say 12, some say 20. He sang in a great many.
Robeson, as an artist, was the one who sang songs in Swahili that came from Africa, who spoke of the nobility in African history.
Shakespeare, the genius that he was, seemed to foreshadow and understand many of the problems that have since arisen in our world, perhaps were present then. To me, Othello is one of a different culture. Shakespeare insists that he's African. There's some argument whether the word black and the fact that he's from Africa is very clear to me. And that Shakespeare posed this problem of a, say, black man in a white society.
I spake of most disastrous chances, of moving accidents by flood and field, of hair-bread scapes to the imminent deadly breach, of being taken by the insolent foe and sold to slavery, my story being done. She gave me for my pains a world of sighs.
When he opens in Othello in London, 21-year-old Peggy Ashcroft is his Desdemona.
As he found out about the relationship with Peggy Ashcroft by opening a letter that Peggy had written to Paul.
At the time of Othello, there was a woman named Yolanda. From mother's point of view, there's one affair too many.
Paul and others who knew Paul well said that Yolanda Jackson was the great love of his life.
She'd been wild when she was young. She got engaged to a Frenchman. The Frenchman's hobby was jazz music, and he'd formed a small jazz group with a number of Americans. She ran away with one of the Americans. The marriage to the American Gaudi lasted 3 weeks, and I think it was after that she met Paul Robeson.
He did fully intend to marry Yolanda.
That was too much for Mother, and for about a year and a half they separated.
He would run into a lot of difficulty with the black community because in those days that was considered bad, particularly if you become a success and they feel she helped to make you a success.
September 27, 1932. It appears he says that he and Yolanda have decided not to marry after all. Paul says Yolanda got a lot of pressure put on her in London, her people, her social world. But Paul says he wants to be free anyway. I'd heard it the other way, that he decided to break off the relationship because he went back to his wife. October 29th, 1932. Paul rang up this afternoon and asked me over to the hotel for tea. He says he would like to stop the proceedings for the divorce and that we should make another try at it.
In 1932, they came together. Some of the romance had permanently gone out of it. There were other people for both of them along the way, but they stuck together through thick and thin till death parted. It was part marriage, part business partnership.
Without Essie, I'm not sure that Paul Robeson would have emerged. She was an extraordinarily intelligent woman. She was watching him. She was watching the audience. She was watching the industry and how it related to him. She was his, in a sense, alter ego for quite a protracted period of time.
Borderline was the work of some avant-gardists. They were fascinated by Robeson as more or less an artistic object. He was the ideal of what I call the Beaux-Arts Negro. That is to say, he was a figure that artists tended to want to frame as the perfect image for black people. And he fit that ideal for so many avant-garde artists, particularly those who photographed him. Many of the photos don't even show his head. They show his tremendous muscular development, but they don't show much of his face. Many of them show him in a cramped space, so he's bent down, and it's almost as though there's a need to control all of this muscular power. Robeson stands for perhaps black manhood, with all of the negative and positive implications that could have. Through the 30s and 40s, there was fundamentally a need to make black people inferior. It was not only a need, it was almost like a law. Thou shalt not show a black person as a human being. The range of roles for black people were limited to buffoons, clowns, maids. They were always subservient characters, just above slaves.
Paul wanted to be a major actor. He was not in the art just for the art. He was in the art both in terms of what it did for him and what he could say with it.
Paul Robeson's films had very limited distribution in America. They were released as so-called ghetto features along with the black independent films, the Oscar Micheaux films.
Oscar Micheaux was this maverick filmmaker. He was the best, most prolific black independent filmmaker of his day. One thinks of Robeson maybe as a powerful screen presence, but subtlety and nuance was not there. So Robeson's acting achievements were separate from his presence on the screen. For one occasion, Robeson plays a villain, and he's a magnificent villain. A jackleg preacher who just got out of jail, and he's robbing money from the offering plate. He's seducing women, and he's enormous in it. And that shows you what Robeson might have done as an actor if he was not locked into these public images. The primary concern when the black male appeared was, do we have to be afraid of this person? In many of these films, there was great satisfaction that his enormous appeal, his almost King Kong kind of strength, could be tamed and channeled, and he turned out to be civilized after all. A black actor was trapped between the expectations of white people on the one hand, and the needs and the desires of uplift of blacks on the other hand.
Did I want to learn how to kill? No, but they
But all kinds of interesting characterizations exist in between that.
These hands that I want to use to heal, to save life, to give life, turned into hands for killing. I'm on the call.
The Emperor Jones is known as Robeson's masterpiece as a film actor.
I'm the only man in the world big enough to get me.
Then you add a silver bullet, Mike?
So she shines.
One of the problems of Robeson's film career is he's often playing magnificent or at least stunning or attractive or fascinating roles in stories that undercut the kind of heroism that he thought should reflect black people's lives.
Look here, white man. There's little stealing like you does, and there's big stealing like I does. For little stealing, they get you in jail sooner or later. For the big stealing, they make you emperor and put you in the Hall of Fame when you croak.
The work that Robeson did in Britain is, in many ways, the saddest work of all. He went to Britain and he met the best people, and he thought he was among peers and friends. And yet, over and over again, these sometimes left-wing people, sometimes liberal people, they were into promoting colonialism.
Sambo of Monrovia, 5 months ago you made yourself chief of the Orkneys. Didn't you know that no man can be chief in the river territories without my permission?
I knew, Lord.
It was the first feature film he made here in 1935, which he had high expectations of. I mean, he was led to believe by the producer, Alexander Calder, that the film would portray African life and culture in a positive way. Well, it didn't.
Warriors came from the old king's country. I've sent my spies after them. You rule 2 million people along the river. But there is only one man who will not run away when he sees the ostrich feathers of the old king's warriors.
And you are that one man?
I am the one man, Lord.
The character he played, Sambo, I mean, it says it all.
Sambo, will you serve my king faithfully?
Every time I've seen the beautiful face of your great king, my heart has filled with joy.
When have you seen his face?
Lord. Oh, little round pieces of silver.
Jomo Kenyatta plays a small role in this film, and he too thought it was wonderful while it was being made.
Lord Sandy, I am your servant.
It took them a long time to catch on to the fact that this film was praising British imperialism, uplifting the white man's burden, and making a travesty of black civilization in Africa.
Paul Robeson is being exploited in more ways than one. His sexuality, his singing, everything they can, they exploit. I think Sanders Adura certainly spurred him on towards greater political awareness from the kind of criticisms that were made of the film. Robeson was particularly vilified by Marcus Garvey, damning his films and saying that these films are slanderous and that he should not be making them.
One aspect of Dad's career is, of course, the financial aspect. There's no question that he got paid. One of the biggest single paydays he ever got was for doing the part of Joe in the movie Showboat. And he named a price that was so high he was sure it would be automatically turned down because he didn't want to do the movie. Too many stereotypes and whatnot. He wasn't really into that. Mother came over here, sat down with Universal, and got him to pay the fee. So then he had to do it.
Song, you and me, we sweat and strain, body all aching and racked with pain. Tote that barge, lift that bale, you get a little drunk and you land in jail. I get weary and sick of trying. I'm tired of living and scared of dying. But old man River, he just keeps rolling along.
You're getting closer to positive stereotypes in Song of Freedom, but they are still stereotypes. In Song of Freedom, Paul is a dock worker whose voice captivates this impresario who lifts him into fame and fortune. He always has this dream that he's connected to some royal lineage in Africa, and so he decides to go back and look for his roots.
Stranger, what do you want with us?
I am no stranger. I am of your race, your blood. I am your king.
You think you are a king because you come to us dressed up in the white man's clothes.
But he brings you knowledge from the great countries over the sea.
Now that was a very radical thing to put in a film at that time. American cinema wouldn't have done it. Can you imagine Stephen Fetchit going to Will Rogers saying, you know, I want to go back to Africa? No way.
The plots that Robeson gets trapped in always have possibilities of exalting some of the things he cared about. And yet, stereotypes always creep back in and snatch the intention that he had in the beginning.
He makes a lot of money for me, but for himself, nothing. It all goes to help those people of his.
Lonely road, wherever you go, you're not that lonely road that I used to know. But I'll keep tramping on, singing my song to the dawn.
So you changed your mind about being a nursemaid, huh?
Hey! Hey! I've been kidnapped!
So that leaves the big fella. And he's not such a big fella either. Had your breakfast yet?
No. What have you got?
You just wait and see.
One of the strengths of Big Fella is that it enables Paul Robeson to have fulfilling relationships with his leading lady.
Such a little thing to ask, but it helps a bit to mask my heartache.
And even to this day, we still don't see that in films very much. A black romance or a black marriage. I think the strengths of the film are certainly Paul Robeson's lovely performance and the camaraderie he has with his co-stars, Elizabeth Welch.
What have you got to laugh at, you big bozo?
And Eslander, his wife, who plays a small acting part in the film.
So la 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 bye bye. Does you want the moon to play with, or the stars to run away with? They'll come if you don't cry. La 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 lullaby. Wiser than all the
Jericho was an exception. The village scenes are authentic, and he's really heroic this time. He really manages to suggest nobility that he really possessed.
In the past, we have been enemies, each tribe traveling alone. Let us now come together for our mutual protection, forming one mighty caravan, safe, at least, from each other.
They are the words of a wise man.
My boy, they go!
Jericho portrays a heroic figure. He does become really one of the first super black heroes in popular cinema.
He was the pathfinder. I mean, he was charting new directions. He was establishing a different persona for the African American on the screen.
Robeson wrote, "I used to do my part and go away feeling satisfied, thinking everything was okay. Well, it wasn't. Things were twisted and changed, distorted. It made me more conscious politically."
Robeson never got a chance to play anybody close to what he was, which was a lawyer, a great athlete, a great speaker, a magnificent voice, the voice of the century.
1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Lord God of Abraham, hear, oh, hear.
Robeson felt that of all the films he made, The Proud Valley was the one that achieved everything that he set out to do.
Hey, was that you?
Yeah. The seeds for this film were planted in 1928 when he first learned of the plight of the Welsh coal miners.
He aligned himself with working class struggles and working class people. The film spoke to him in that way.
How's the time, Dave? I've had about enough for this shift.
You only got 10 minutes to go.
Good.
The thing about Paul was really that his first link with the British working class movement was with the Welsh miners. It didn't begin in the salons of intellectuals. It began there.
Trevor wants number 2 rescued him down at once. Come on, boys.
It was through his contact with the Welsh miners that he realized he was working class as well as black.
There was a disaster when I was a child in a colliery not very far from us. And then the coal owners and the bosses arrived in a car, and the first thing they asked, were there any pit ponies killed or damaged in the explosion? And they never asked about the men. They asked about the pit ponies, as they had had to buy the pit ponies, of course. They didn't know Paul Robeson was in London. They never thought they'd ever meet him. But they did, because he was performing at the Drury Lane Theatre with a stage show of Showboat.
He was coming out of a performance of Showboat, a matinee, and a group of Welsh workers who had walked from Wales to London were singing in the streets. So Dad heard them singing, and on impulse, he fell in with them.
Union men had been locked out of the pits by mine owners, determined to crush their protest against inhuman working conditions, miserable pay, and few, if any, benefits.
The coal owners, they blacklegged the whole lot of them, and they locked them out of the colliery. Thousands of them, not just a handful. There was nothing else. They couldn't just leave a pit and find a job elsewhere. There was nothing for them. Many, many families were on the verge of starvation. And this group said, we've got nothing to lose. Let's go all the way to London. They've got plenty up there. We've got nothing. We're like a forgotten race. And they decided to walk all the way to London. Paul Robeson heard the whole sad story, and he took them for their first meal for days. And he had all the gen about all the problems and where, because he didn't even know there was a place called Wales.
And then he said that he organized writers and performers, actors, to raise money to send a freight car load of food and clothing up to the mining valleys.
Paul Robeson came down on his very first visit to South Wales at the beginning of 1929. And he came back again when, of course, he was making Proud Valley, the film, the location shots of Llantrisson, Gilfach Goch and the Rhondda.
Here, what the hell do you think you're doing, eh?
Sorry, friend. I didn't see you. You didn't have films about miners, and certainly miners who were heroes or martyrs.
Back to work with no repining all through the night. Overhead the stars are shining. All through the night we're singing. Dream the dark but dream of fleeting. Morning sun brings flowers leading. Sing me then a song of greeting.
Robeson came in 10th in terms of the most popular international star. And of course, he was the only black person who came remotely that high on the list.
Pass on the drinks, kid. Look out for me, gentlemen friend.
Robeson's appeal to white viewers was this kind of warm, cuddly presence.
That's what I like about you, Joe. You're so very soft-hearted.
Robeson had this magnificent personality, this magnificent presence on the screen. When he sang, then they loved him. The singing was almost crucial.
Oh, I know that steamer's taking folks to Harlem. The river steals.
His voice was a marvelous melter of resistance.
My little children grow up and leave me. They seem to think they'll be free. So they board that steamer heading off to Harlem. The river steals my folks from me.
Black people saw the contrast between what Robeson was and what he was playing, and that made it even more painful because he was falling so far below what they wanted him to be. The movies were the place where the fundamental national ideals were set up, and in this society, they wanted to protect that arena. And so to break the barrier against showing black people as human there would have been a great accomplishment.
When they see that steamer taking folks to Harlem, river steals my folks from me.
That was one of his ambitions, to do that, to alter the perception of black people in movies. But that's one place where he had very few victories and a lot of defeats.
To thoroughly understand Robeson is to understand the struggle in which he was engaged. To be an artist was to strike a blow with a song, which in his voice and in his hand became a battle axe.
There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man I don't like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free? Oh,
The name Paul Robeson is now synonymous with Old Man River. Over the years, however, his interpretation changes. He modifies the lyrics to emphasize struggle, not subservience.
aching and racked with pain. Tote that barge, lift that bale. You show a little grit and you land in jail. But I keeps laughing instead of crying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying. And old man River, he'll just keep rolling along.
I don't think he made a transition from entertainer to socialist. His awareness of prejudice when he was young, that really gave him an authenticity that you wouldn't have got from reading Karl Marx when you were a kid and deciding you were a communist. And then he went to the Soviet Union and he saw, with all its defects, the Soviet Union was an experiment in socialism which transformed the prospects all over the world for oppressed people.
I think he had this idea of what the world could be, and he thought that maybe it was going to happen there.
He was urged to go there by African radicals in London, in particular George Padmore, Jomo Kenyatta, Zikwe, and others. Sergei Eisenstein, the great Soviet film director, invited Dad to come to Moscow to talk about doing a film that Eisenstein wanted to do about the Haitian Revolution.
When he sang in the Bolshoi Theater, there was an adoring, almost worshipful audience. They were packed outside in the streets by the thousands.
Here, for the first time, I'm treated as a full human being. I walk in full human dignity. You cannot imagine what that means to me as a Negro. That was a direct quote.
What gripped him was the Russian Constitution, Article 123, which stated in its categorical terseness the complete equality of all peoples in the Soviet Union and made racism an offense.
To him, socialism was the destiny of mankind. He saw this in the Soviet Union.
1937, that was when he really decided that his career as a performer of any kind now has to take second place. And he made his speech in Albert Hall in England.
The climax of this speech became his epitaph. The artist must take sides. He must elect to fight for freedom or for slavery. I have made my choice. I had no alternative.
Para la noche buena, mamita mia.
He was greatly energized by the need to move against fascism. He made this link between his music and the struggle for human liberation.
Insurgent generals, for insurgent generals, for insurgent generals, mamita mia.
When the war in Spain began, fascism was spreading in Europe. In Italy, there was opposition to Mussolini, but he still beat down the opposition. In Germany, there was opposition to Hitler, but Hitler was able to crush it. But in Spain, there was resistance by arms.
They will avenge you, but your courageous children, but your courageous children, but your courageous children, mamita mia, they will avenge you, they will.
In the winter of 1938, Paul and Essie arrive at the front.
Paul went all around the country and he sang wherever he went to ordinary soldiers. He also visited and sang in the hospitals.
It was a feeling of elation, of awe, of inspiration. You felt so inspired when you heard this man sing.
He broadened the understanding of what was happening in the fight against fascism, but he also gave the desperate, last-minute, last hope a new lift.
The Spanish Civil War is one of several preludes to World War II, as totalitarian forces strike on 3 continents.
As streams of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany flowed into London, Robeson began to give concerts to support them. He began to see the connection between Nazism for Jews and Nazism for blacks, that if Hitler triumphed, blacks would be worse than enslaved.
Fearing the imminent outbreak of war in Europe, the Robeson family returns home to America. Robeson's years abroad have somewhat dimmed his American reputation, but one radio show changes all that. On November 5th, 1939, the CBS network sends Ballad for Americans out onto the airwaves.
It was the Ballad for Americans. I remember my wife and I listening to it.
In 76, the sky was red.
It was one of the highlights of that period.
In his bed, and on that stormy morn, old Uncle Sam was born.
What sort of happened is we had a policy of engaging stars, Hollywood people, people of the theater, and writers, artists, and they came on the series with programs about America.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Among these rights are life,
Yes, sir.
liberty,
That's right.
and the pursuit of happiness.
At the time the Ballad for Americans was produced, the very fact that the spokesman for America was a black meant something.
Lynchings were going on. Segregation was unchallenged. Blacks did not have the ballot. There was all this talk about the free world, and there was not even the semblance of freedom for black people around the world at that time.
That's it.
Let my people go.
That's the idea.
Robeson was without stain of any kind in the public perception.
You might say he was one of the most famous singers in the world. Everybody knew who Robeson was. And when he spoke, he was listened to.
Out of the murders and lynching, out of the...
The audience gave it an ovation, and the cheering wouldn't stop.
But the thing I remember about it is the station saying that never before in their history did they get so many phone calls praising that program, praising Paul Robeson. They said it was the most they had ever received.
Robeson crisscrosses America on a lucrative concert tour.
Oh, my baby, my curly-headed...
November 17, 1941. Dearest Carlo and Fania, we are all simply crazy about the country and have settled down permanently to country life. The house is divine.
So la 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 bye bye, in your mother's arms be creeping, and soon you'll be a-sleeping. La 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 la.
Big Paul loves the quiet and low gear of the place and flies home for every moment he can spare, even when on tour.
For the moon to run away with, they'll come if you don't cry.
He said to me, Lloyd, what would I be doing out there? You go out of the house in Enfield, you're nowhere. Look magazine did a series on him. People want to see a man and his family, the whole thing. Those pictures were staged.
They led pretty independent lives. He would be there some of the times, but basically I think his life was rooted in New York City.
Essie was taking a degree in anthropology. She was herself trying to write plays. She had written 2 books. she had some real hopes that she could develop an independent career. Paul Sr. never claimed that he was cut out for marriage and parenting. And there doesn't seem to have been much attention to Paul Jr. when he was growing up.
I can honestly say, for me, yeah, there were downsides. But overall, I wouldn't trade him for anybody in the universe.
Theatergoers eagerly await Robeson's appearance as Othello at Broadway's Schubert Theater on October 19th, 1943.
First, I would say that here is a part which has dignity for the Negro actor. Often we don't get those opportunities. And I would say that my people will be very proud of my or any other Negro actor appearing in such a part.
No more of that. I pray you in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice.
His co-stars are the husband-wife team of Uta Hagen and Jose Ferrer.
The very existence of a black man on stage with a white woman whom he kissed, fondled, held, slapped, strangled, and so forth was in itself a theater event. You saw that this was a phenomenally, potentially wonderful actor. His lack of skill did not seem to bother anybody, but I think there was a lack of skill.
I didn't see him as a trained actor. I saw him as a very sincere, very powerful, very committed human being. And when I could blend that with Othello, that's the finest Othello.
He was, of course, brilliant. He had wonderful speech. He had a magnificent voice. He had great intelligence. What he had a presence, charisma, and a human vibration that was so overpowering. Suddenly, a genuine black man in that role made the play have a meaning that it couldn't have had when someone's going around with coal on their face.
Following the end of the extraordinary Broadway run, the company launched a 9-month cross-country tour.
Segregated houses were the norm. We broke the precedent of playing to segregated audiences. We refused.
I had an experience in 1944 playing in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is just on the border of the South. And from Louisville, Kentucky, across the river, quite a few people came over. And for about half the performance, nobody knew what was going to happen. Everything was very tense. And I was very careful how close I got to Desdemona, for example. I didn't get too close there. And there was real tension.
We had a 3-year relationship. It started rather early in the run in New York. It was absolutely instigated by him. It startled me so that it shattered my world, and I went hook, line, and sinker in Boston in a hotel. We got on the elevator, and a woman got on, took one look at the two of us. I had my arm through his, and she hawked up and spit me in the face. That was almost to be expected in the 40s. But I had a feeling that I was learning something every day, but the end result I didn't really see until 10 years later, as I saw that what we had done had influenced things, that things were changing.
Come to bed, my lord.
Have you prayed tonight, Desdemona?
Aye, my lord.
If you bethink yourself of any crime, unreconciled as yet to heaven and grace, solicit for it straight.
When I saw him in Othello, the audience was absolutely transfixed. His Othello has the longest run, 296 performances of any Shakespeare play on Broadway.
In the 1940s, Robeson was the most famous black man in the world. He got major concert fees. He was considered by white America to be the model Negro, somebody who behaved with great decorum and dignity, somebody who dutifully went out and sold war bonds, thereby declaring that he believed in the country's purposes and in the country's values. His previous statements about socialism and his commitment to the Soviet Union were conveniently ignored.
Robeson was always there speaking, raising money for Liberty bonds and for war bonds, pointing out to black people that we had a responsibility to be part of that struggle, even if we had to make alliances with those who were traditionally our enemy.
During and after World War II, it was important for black people to continue to make that link between the double V, the V for victory over fascism and the V for victory over discrimination here at home, or Jim Crow as it was called.
I'd like to do a tribute to that army which is bearing the brunt today, but I hope will not be bearing it too long alone. The great Russian army.
Robeson had some real hope that if the United States remained friendly with the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union would have a significant influence on this country's ideology.
Rise triumphant, the brave Russian folk, the militant folk, yes, ready for sorrow and ready to suffer, yes, ready to fight till death.
World War II is going on, and it was the good thing to be progressive and left at that time.
When you have a picket line, Robeson shows up on the picket line.
Ezekiel saw the wheel, yes, Lord, way up in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel, way in the middle of the air. Little wheel run by faith, big wheel run by the grace of God. This wheel, way in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel.
He always emphasized this need for unity between the black people and the unions. Neither, he felt, could advance without the help of the other.
Little wheel run by faith, big wheel run by the grace of God. This wheel, way in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel, yes, Lord, way up in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel, way in the middle of the air.
He preached trade unionism wherever he went. He fought for the trade unions. He fought for the right of working people to organize trade unions.
I am today giving up my concerts for 2 or 3 years to enter into this struggle at a very, it's what I call getting into the rank and file struggle of my people for full citizenship in these United States. So I won't be singing, except for the rights of my people for the next couple of years. No pretty songs, gentlemen. No pretty songs. Time for some full citizenship. Understandable?
We had had huge expectations that America would be a more friendly and a more compassionate and a more rewarding place to be, especially since we had demonstrated our courage and our willingness to fight for this country.
Some 41 lynchings occurred in 1946 alone, right after the war, which led Robeson and other people of influence to form an organization called the American Crusade to End Lynching. He was the chief spokesman for the American Crusade Against Lynching when he and others went to talk to Harry Truman in the White House about lynching in America.
A very broad committee went in to protest the lynchings of the Negro boys in the South. He said that it wasn't politically expedient to do anything about lynching.
Paul thereupon said, well, if the government isn't going to defend us, then we're going to have to defend ourselves.
So Truman says, oh no, Mr. Robeson, let's not have any of that talk here.
Vote Wallace and Taylor. Vote progressive.
By 1948, we decided that America needed another alternative. Republicans and Democrats were wholly unsatisfactory. Central to this mobilization was Paul Robeson. He was at any number of these rallies nationally helping to build the Progressive Party, to help build a new voice of reason and of hope.
Henry A. Wallace, Franklin Roosevelt's vice president and Secretary of Commerce under Harry Truman.
I am committed to wipe out segregation, to prevent the fear-makers from clogging the minds of the people with the red issue.
His Progressive Party brings together a wide range of liberals and radicals, from disaffected Democrats to hardline communists.
Let us say it in unison. We want Henry Wallace.
From the village, from the city, all the nation's voice.
We're going to see a tremendous demonstration. And I know it, too, because a lot of my work has been on street corners. We're going to Cleveland, for example, fight to get a hall, 2,000 people in the hall. And I've spoken to as many as 10 to 12 to 14,000 people in one night. But I know, and we're going to come out of this a tremendously strong party.
Now that fascism has been beaten back, Russia is redefined as the primary enemy. It's communism now that's the threat, no longer fascism.
I'm an anti-fascist, and I would feel, perhaps, that any war against the Soviet Union would be a fascist war. Why not talk about peace and friendship with the Soviet people?
The vote for Henry Wallace was also a vote for peace with the Soviet Union, because this was the basis of his platform.
On election day, Strom Thurmond's racist Dixiecrats outpolled the progressives by 12,000 votes.
Today we are rallying our forces for the greatest struggle in our history. In that struggle, I ask your support, yielding neither to communism nor to reaction.
Rabid anti-communists initiate a smear campaign against Robeson. As concert dates are canceled, he and Lawrence Brown must go to Europe in order to work. In April, he comes to Paris to address the Congress of the World Partisans of Peace.
He made a very controversial statement that it was inconceivable to him that Black Americans would fight for a country that had held them in subjugation for centuries against a country, meaning the Soviet Union, who had raised its minority people to full citizenship in one generation.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he.
First of all, I think it was taken out of context, what he said. And what he said was perfectly true. Many people have said it, but when he said it, it was particularly scathing.
The white right-wing press was absolutely delighted and used it everywhere. It was somewhat more of a surprise that the liberal white press, who had earlier regarded Robeson as a considerable hero, also turned on him.
There was distortion, and it seems that no great effort was made on the part of civil rights leadership to find out what the man said.
For the first time, as I stepped on Soviet soil, I felt myself a full human being. A full human being. So it is unthinkable to me today that colored peoples in any part of the world would ever join a war or attacks upon the Soviet Union.
Generally, the leadership in Black organizations have been hesitant to take positions on international questions of war and peace.
The NAACP issued a statement saying that they do not believe that Mr. Robeson speaks for the overwhelming majority of Black people in this country.
Roy Wilkins, consciously and deliberately at the time, joined the Hoovers and the right wing. When Dad said it's unthinkable blacks will go to war, Wilkins is quoted as saying, "We will fight loyally for this country no matter how many of us they lynch."
During World War II, Paul had joined hands with the white establishment. They were working in tandem to push a common cause, to destroy fascism. After the war, he was denouncing the white establishment, and he was giving voice to a lot of the most profound grievances that African Americans had long felt, and with the established black leadership had not been vocalizing.
Says, Paul, come here, we'll tell you what we want. Yes, we want to be free. Now, you're a little too rough You're a little ahead of us, but we admire you. We're with you. But you're just too little up front. Now, come back here and let us tell you what we want. Okay, okay. So I learned from them. And then they are willing to come a little step further in the understanding of things. And today they understand much more.
Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP, had denounced Paul and had distanced himself from the left in order to be able to secure his own position of power.
The NAACP actually conspired with the State Department.
It was arranged for an article to appear in the Crisis magazine, the official organ of the NAACP, claiming that Paul Robeson was naive.
The Crisis took an article written under a pseudonym. It was titled Paul Robeson, Lost Shepherd, of how Paul Robeson was duped by the communists and had, in that sense, betrayed his own people. To put in the Crisis and then send all over Africa vilifying Paul Robeson.
While the outcry over his Paris remarks rages at home, Paul's tour continues through Eastern Europe. In June, he arrives in Moscow.
So he goes to Moscow and, greeted like a conquering hero, he asks to see Isaac Pfeffer, who has disappeared.
I have to see my friend Isaac Pfeffer. Where is he?
He was actually in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow.
Why can't I see him? As a result of that, he was brought to Robeson's hotel.
Knock on the door, and there's Pfeffer, alone, looking a bit pale.
While they were talking, they were passing each other notes.
And Pfeffer makes gestures saying that the place is bugged. Where have you been? Prison. What can I do? Don't say a mumbling word or we're all dead instantly, not only us, but our families.
Soon after Stalin came to power in the 1930s, he began a concerted campaign of literally murdering off the major intellectual and artistic figures in the Jewish community.
Pfeffer seems to have made it clear to Robeson not only that the purge of Jewish intellectuals was widespread, but that he himself was soon going to be killed.
Pfeffer went like this, meaning we're dead.
In fact, it was 3 years later that he was shot.
Shortly after that, Paul gave a concert in Tchaikovsky Hall.
It was broadcast nationally live. Sang the concert, huge success.
Robeson spoke of having recently seen Pfeffer.
And this gasp, Isaac Pfeffer is a disappeared person.
And when it came to the encore, what Robeson sang was Zognet Keinmal, the song of the Warsaw Ghetto resistance.
Zognet Keinmal hast du gehst dem letzten Wege, wenn Himmeln bleien verstellen bläue Tage, weil kommen wird noch unser ausgebenkte Show, uns wird abbeugt und unser Trott mir sein in Klo.
Never say that you have reached the very end when leaden skies a bit of future may portend. For sure the hour for which we yearn will yet arrive, and our marching steps will thunder. We survive.
That he sang in Yiddish. I think it's one of the most incredible moments in the history of that regime. The final years of Stalin, this issue, introduced by Robeson publicly through the singing of that marvelous song, results in that controversy for that evening.
Nos hat der Volk zwischen Fallen dekadent, das Lied gesungen mit ner Gammes in die Hand.
When Robeson returns to the United States, soon after, in fact, and is met by a group of reporters, and they ask him, is it true about this purge? And Robeson said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I recently saw Isaac Pfeffer, for example, and a number of my other friends. There is no such purge.
If people, and there are many people, say, how could this wonderful guy we love do that and not denounce this evil? His was a world of relative evils.
Just think what it would have meant when he was in the Soviet Union, if he had denounced this, if he had taken a position, comes back comes back to the United States and does the same thing, lies again and again and again, denies that there's such an issue. He lies, and he knows better.
He was not about to come to the United States and criticize the Soviet Union, which in his opinion was a barrier to world domination by the right wing of this system.
But when he came back, then all the trouble really started for him then.
And we must have the courage to shout at the top of our voices about our injustices. And we must lay the blame where it belongs and where it has belonged for over 300 years of slavery and continuous misery right here on our own doorstep. We do not want to die in vain anymore on foreign battlefields.
Baseball's top hitter and star second baseman of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, comes to bat for Uncle Sam to refute Paul Robeson's remark that U.S. Negroes would not fight in a war against Russia.
I'm on my way to Washington to testify before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. That's all I can say at this time. I'll make further statements from Washington.
Jackie Robinson was the hottest, quote-unquote, Negro that they could find. He was the embodiment of integration, everything they, the white power structure, wanted integration to be.
Paul Robeson sent a letter to Jackie Robinson telling him what he had said in Paris. So Jackie knew before he went there, but he was under pressure to go from the government, from the Dodgers.
I hope that your work this coming season will be such that you will even merit even a better contract than this one. Well, thank you very much, Ricky.
Rachel Robinson wrote that they weren't sure he was going to go down, but then he was convinced he had to or he'd never have a career.
You have to remember, at the time, McCarthyism had everybody backed up. I mean, being called a communist was really very serious. People in the black community were afraid of it.
The Urban League arranged for Jackie to appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
I've been asked to express my views on Paul Robeson's statements in Paris to the effect that American Negroes would refuse to fight in any war against Russia because we love Russia so much. I haven't any comment to make on that statement except that if Mr. Robeson actually made it, it sounds very silly to me. And most Negroes and Italians and Irish and Jews and Swedes and Slavs and other Americans would act just as all these groups did in the last war.
Paul Robeson has a press conference, and he tells the reporters, if you're out to get me to attack Jackie Robinson, Rob, that's what they want us to do, pit one against the other.
Jackie, years later, when he published his book, I Never Had It Made, said that if he had to do it again, he wouldn't have done it.
Instead of saying, I told you so, Paul felt Jackie must have suffered all this time. That's what he thought.
Those were the worst years that America ever experienced, with demented persecution of the left.
Robeson had, for a number of years, given concerts for a small group called the Civil Rights Congress, and it might have had 500 or 1,000 people at most.
Paul telephoned us from Grand Central. He had heard that there was trouble, some kind of organizing against him. And instead of him taking a taxi from the Peekskill station to the concert grounds, he asked that I meet him.
He'd invited me to sing a few songs at the beginning, and with my 65-year-old mother, I'm driving there, but there's big traffic jam.
As we approached closer and closer, you could hear the shouting and the noise and some screaming.
I see a state policeman. I said, officer, can you help me get through? I'm singing here tonight. He looked at me rather peculiarly, said, there's not going to be any concert, just strode on.
Members of the Veterans Parade broke through the woods, overran the concert bowl, and started to rip apart the stage where Robeson was to sing.
And the concert planned for August 27th never took place.
When that happened, Harlem and black folks and progressive folks all over the country were aroused. It was a huge meeting at the Golden Gate Ballroom in the middle of Harlem, Lenox Avenue, at which there must have been 5,000 people inside and 10,000 gathered outside.
The surest way to get that police protection is to have it very clear that we'll protect ourselves and good.
Should we allow them
to have this victory? Should we allow them to have their way on the fact that Paul Robeson was not allowed to sing? Were we going to let them have their way? No.
We planned a real outdoor concert, and Paul said absolutely he was willing.
Second Peekskill, huge number of people came. People from all over Harlem, all over the state came to hear a Paul Robeson concert.
Here's greet left-wing Robesonites from New York. 900 state and local police keep order.
We decided that we would put a wall of trade union men standing shoulder to shoulder around the entire picnic grounds. A group of some 8 men volunteered to form a human wall in front of Paul while he sang.
And I was there among many of us who circled the platform and stood and watched the crowd.
And up on a hill, the trade union guards had flushed out at least one sniper's nest.
2 men with high-powered rifles who were waiting there for an opportunity to kill Paul.
The concert itself ran very smoothly. It was a beautiful concert, and there were about 25,000 people there who came up to Peekskill.
Now, it's when the people are breaking up, each going their own way, taking busloads that came in from New York and different parts. It's when that was taking place, then the cowards began to respond. And the police stood by and did nothing.
They wanted to get past us and kill Paul. There's no question in my mind.
The veterans organizations disclaim responsibility for the post-concert attacks, and for 5 hours the fighting rages over 10 square miles of countryside. Cars are stoned and overturned, and 145 people are injured.
Mr. and Mrs. United States, this is to give you the background and the real reason for the riots between the war veterans and the Paul Robeson followers of Moscow at Peekskill, New York. The communists are striving to start a worldwide race war, and the biggest laugh of the month is that Paul Robeson, who graduated with honors from an American university and who in one night earns more than the average American earns in a year, says that in America, a Negro hasn't a chance.
Governor Dewey has ordered a grand jury investigation. He charged that Robeson's communist followers had provoked the disorder. He said the inquiry would be complete and impartial.
No more concerts after that. 85 to 86 concerts canceled in a matter of 5 or 6 months. The highest paid concert artist in the world up until the time of his blacklisting. A man whose salary drops from over $100,000 a year to less than $6,000 a year and remains there for almost a decade.
No theater or auditorium could rent to him, or they knew that that place might be burnt down under, quote, mysterious circumstances.
Carnegie Hall wouldn't rent to any group that would also include Paul Robeson.
You couldn't put a sign in a record store advertising Paul Robeson records. You couldn't play his records on the radio and keep your job. Some of us got together and formed a record company called Othello Records to put out recordings by my father. The FBI began keeping records on Dad in the late 1930s, when he went to the Soviet Union several times. He was selling war bonds, where he went to the White House, doing Ballot for Americans, etc.
It wasn't only that they tapped his phone, they also opened his mail. An agent followed him nearly every day, so he was under constant surveillance.
The object was to utterly isolate him.
He was very beautifully protective of some of the people around him. He took them aside and he said, I know you love me, but it's a very bad idea to be seen with me now.
The attempt of the enemy was to cut off the progressive people from the great masses of the Americans. In my own case, it was to cut me off from the Negro people from whom I am born. Imagine, somewhere somebody says, I, born a Negro, that because of my beliefs, my fight for peace, my fight for friendship between nations, my fight for the complete liberation of my people, that somewhere I'm not an American and that I should be cut off from the very people from whom I was born.
Paul Robeson was the most persecuted, the most ostracized, the most condemned black man in America then or ever.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column if there ever was one. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia, not the United States.
In 1950, they took away Paul's passport. The United States government did, because he was a socialist and they didn't like it.
Lifting a passport and refusing to let a citizen travel is the equivalent of branding him an enemy, a traitor.
The State Department made it very clear when his passport was denied him that he had been extremely active on behalf of the colonial peoples of Africa. Not because he was a communist, not because of his close association with the Soviet Union, but because he had been extremely active on behalf of the colonial peoples of Africa.
Am I a communist? The Communist Party is a legal party. I have as much right to be a member of the Communist Party as I have to be of the Republican or the Democratic Party. But in protecting the civil rights of all Americans, it's none of your business.
My father was never a member of the Communist Party and never considered becoming one. He was a free man. His idea was that if you wanted to really impact African American opinion and be a factor in leadership, you had to be independent of any outside control.
The armies of the right continue their campaign to destroy Robeson's effectiveness as a spokesman for progressive causes. Robeson remains defiant.
He was quite ill. He had lost considerable weight because he had had an operation. Subpoena came for him to go before the House On-American Activities Committee. We were wondering, you know, is Paul up to it? Is he strong enough to do it? But when we went to the hearings, he was strong, he was defiant.
The committee asks, "Why do you not stay in Russia?" Robeson replies, "Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country, and I am going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?"
The committee asked Congress to charge him with contempt of Congress. Of course, he had contempt of Congress, but not legally.
Several hundred African Americans were indicted in one way or other during the McCarthy period. It wasn't only Paul Robeson.
In the federal court in New York, trial begins for 11 of the 12 communist leaders who are charged with a conspiracy to teach and advocate the forcible overthrow of the U.S. government.
Ben Davis, black leader of the Communist Party, lawyer, former city councilman in New York, he had been sent to prison under the Smith Act.
With their conviction upheld by the United States Supreme Court, they must serve 5 years and pay $10,000 in fines. Prison gates close on the nation's top Reds.
Ben Davis had been a city councilman. Paul had been helpful in that campaign. They were very, very close. He was not going to let the government dictate to him with whom he could be friends and those that he had to hate.
Josh White, the great blues singer, just worshipped Paul Robeson. Josh White gets called up for this committee.
Josh White came to see Dad and said, "I've been trapped by the House On-American Activities Committee, and I have to give them 2 names of people I think are communists. One of them's going to be yours."
That's America to me.
And he cried.
So the next day he went and disowned Paul Robeson and his various lefty friends.
And he told me, if you're going to get that angry, don't waste the energy on Josh White. Turn that energy and that anger against those who made him do that.
Drive my way, take the communists, and string them up right now. You're ready for
People became a little frightened to come to my concerts, and hoodlums stood outside. It stopped me from appearing in many of the auditoriums in America, that is, they weren't open to me.
He did sing at some black churches. He sang at some schools. This became his base of operation, but it didn't help to earn him an income.
I went to the church. It seated about 800 people. When I got there, the minister had disappeared. He'd become frightened. And there were 30 people in the hall. A few days later, somewhere else, and there were 50 people.
The FBI would come along and start ostentatiously taking down license number. They wanted the audience to see that they're taking down your license number.
Some unions that he had really gone out of his way to help win strikes, the UAW and Walter Reuther, backed away. He wasn't welcome to sing for the unions anymore, except a few of the left-wing unions like UE, the electrical workers.
His name dropped from the white press as though he didn't exist. He was a non-person.
They literally erased him from history for 15 years or 20 years. They wiped him out.
It was a mixed response in the African-American press.
The black press gave him a platform, gave him editorial support, gave him repertorial support.
They were for him because he was saying the things that they were also editorializing about. But there was always that fear that they would be considered communist associated.
When Dad was being persecuted here, he was ever more popular abroad. And there was a huge campaign to restore his passport. He was an immensely popular artist.
My family, and I am sure many other families in this United States, greet you on this historic occasion. Certainly, all decent human beings must find and will find a way to peace, understanding, and friendship. And millions of Americans hunger for peace, as do you. And we are firmly convinced that peace will conquer war.
The campaign in those days, I think, was called Let Paul Robeson Sing. And the Miners' Union in South Wales sent him invitations every year to come to this concert hall. And of course, he couldn't come because he didn't have his passport.
Hello, Paul Robeson. This is Will Painter, president of the South Wales Miners, speaking. We would like...
Again, it was the British workers who were at the forefront of this struggle. And as a consequence, you then have the transatlantic broadcasts, 1957, both from St Pancras Town Hall and from Wales.
Many of us still didn't believe that it would happen because the technology was so new. The cable had just been laid earlier in the year.
Thank you so much. That came over very beautifully, and I certainly know that very soon, I hope I shall be there in the valleys and in Wales with you.
This man had been incarcerated in his own country, and he was still there.
He could even have gotten his passport. All he had to do was to dictate a non-communist oath. He says that's unconstitutional, it's unprincipled, other people are being kept back. I'm not going to take that way out.
I consider more that the defense of every American, including people of every political opinion, including the communists of these United States, to their free political expression, is the very essence of the defense of our civil liberties, and by that I shall always stand.
There is a balm in Gilead.
By the spring of 1958, the walls of internal exile are crumbling. When Paul Robeson sings, the concert halls are again filled. In May, he performs at Carnegie Hall.
It sold out in a blink of an eye. I found out that Paul Robeson had appeared in San Francisco, that there were pickets there, and that he had quite a sizable audience and that he was successful. It was unbelievable. The second concert sold out just as fast. The reaction afterwards was almost universal. I think there was a sigh of relief.
The Robeson campaign gains a victory when, in June 1958, the Supreme Court rules that the State Department cannot seize citizens' passports for political reasons. For the first time in 8 years, Robeson is free to leave.
The struggle has been won in my own case, in my own land, in America. And as I pointed out, I have just finished a long concert tour all over America. And as a matter of fact, if I hadn't gotten my passport, I would be now singing in the largest halls in America at the highest prices. I intend to go back sometime.
When he came, he had a huge impact on the peace movement because he was seen not only as a great socialist, but as somebody campaigning against the Cold War. He supported the anti-colonial movement, so he became a very important part of a whole post-war movement.
Time is running short, and our voices must be heard all over this land and all over the entire earth. The powerful ones will listen if we cry still louder, if we work perseveringly to persuade the millions who stand ready to join in the demand for an end to this nuclear bomb nonsense and the completely suicidal gyrations of a few gentlemen who fail to recognize that a new world has already been born and will never turn back.
Raya, at moja ita moja, avinjom, avinkom, narod da boj, narod baje boj, gotovi na gorje, gotovi na muki, gotovi na smrti.
It's tremendously buoying to him, the tumultuous reception he gets when he returns to Moscow. And it seems to repair the bruises of the isolation of more than a decade.
He was lionized there. The concert audiences came. They loved him. They loved the way he sang their language. Then they named a mountain, one of their highest mountains, after Paul Robeson.
We have been given a sanitized myth of Paul Robeson. What we get is the marvelous singer, the great actor, the man who stood up to the McCarthyites. But what we don't get is the 40-year history of defense and support for a movement based upon terror and mass murder. Even after the 20th Congress, even after the Soviet leadership themselves acknowledged that Stalin was this mass murder, acknowledged the crimes of Stalin, Robeson keeps on.
The assumption is all communists are the same. Robeson knows that there are as many gradations in the Soviet Union as they are in the United States. Dad, when he entered that system, was always with the reformers. He did what he could to help them against the other guys. In his opinion, the main enemy of mankind, humankind at the time, was not Stalin, not the Soviet Union, but the right wing of the United States.
He wasn't going to himself become an obstacle to the possible future resurgence of socialism by giving any ammunition to the enemy, the conservative capitalists.
Paul Robeson sees the Soviet Union as a bulwark to the colonial liberation movement. So his own personal views of them now was combined with the fact that he saw that the Soviet Union is somebody who is going to help other countries get free of imperialism.
Afrika novi, rvuca akovi, solnce svobodi vstajot.
At the very center of Robeson's world vision, both culturally and politically, was a vision of the role that might be played by the newly emerging former colonial nations of Asia and Africa.
Have you come back from Moscow still a convinced communist?
I don't see how you can ask me that. How do you know I'm a communist? Nobody else knows. So I resent the question.
I beg
will
your
you
pardon.
rephrase it, please? Yes.
What are your political opinions? Have they been changed at
My
all?
political opinions about the Soviet Union have only been deepened. As I said in the Soviet Union, I'm a believer in socialism, and I would say with Dr. Du Bois that I believe that the socialist lands, in the sense of the Soviet Union, China, and the people's democracies, are the hope. Can I repeat it? The hope of the future.
I know that all left-wing parties in Britain claim it was their pressure that got him out of America. There's a degree of truth in that. It was the pressure and the invitation from the Shakespeare Company to come and play Othello that really broke the logjam. He had an immense effect, not because he was a political animal, but because he was a great, great artist. I think the Americans felt that they would be so embarrassed if this great artist were refused permission to come and play Othello in Stratford.
Well, we're in the wings of the Stratford Memorial Theatre, where everybody's getting ready for the dress rehearsal of Othello, in which both Paul Robeson and Mary Ure will be appearing at Stratford for the first time.
And learn how to play with other actors, you know. Being a solo singer, you walk on the stage, and before you know it, you're out there doing your piece. So I just used to wait for that big speech and let it roll. But I feel I've learned a tremendous lot from this production. Arise, black vengeance, from thy hollow cell. Yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyranny. Swell. Well, yes, it could be done, but Mr. Richardson said, now, Paul, now, wait a minute now. Just get some truth here. Don't quite roll it out so much.
He didn't have a lot to learn about Othello. We all had a lot to learn about the roles we were playing. One day in rehearsal, Tony said, I think it would be absolutely marvelous if we improvised the first jealousy scene. So Sam Wanamaker, who was playing Iago, immediately went to a different place of the stage, moved in different places, spoke his own lines.
Iago's telling me, well, now, something's going on here. Beware, my lord, of jealousy. Well, what are you talking about, fella? We've come clean here. What are you talking about? Give me the... And I said, well, I don't think that's all right, my wife. Why not? And then suddenly he says, well, now, since you give me the right to say so, I'll let it out. Now, look to your wife and look to Cat. Man, what are you talking about? You mean that? You, whom I trust so much, telling me that I must watch my wife with Cassie? Then I translated it back to Shakespeare, but it makes little sense that way.
It was agony for him. He wasn't sure ever that he would remember the next sentence.
I would say I encountered a very fatigued human being. And I don't say a tired actor, because the fatigue from that is slightly different. I thought there was a greater fatigue, a deeper fatigue.
When in the
There'd been a big family argument between him and my mother as to whether he should return to the U.S. He'd been in Europe long enough. That was his feeling.
She liked being in London, and she liked being Mrs. Paul Robeson.
Also, he was kind of tired. He'd done Othello. His health had deteriorated. He had the beginnings of heart problems.
Mr. Robeson, you've been distinguished as an actor, a singer, and as a recording artist for some 40 years now. Have you any thought of retirement?
Well, no. To speak very frankly, no. One of the reasons, of course, that retirement wouldn't particularly come in, you'll find that out as I begin my singing. I sing where I speak. For about 8 years, you know, it was very difficult for me to work in America. When I came back to London in 1958, I started again, played Othello, and been singing, TV and records, and doing pretty well.
In '61, he made up his mind. He was going to come home, and on the way he's going to go to the places that he couldn't go because of the passport restrictions, namely China, Africa, and India, and last but not least, he decided to drop off on the way and say hello to Fidel Castro in Cuba. And the Freedom of Information Act documents show that the FBI and CIA found out about it. Certainly they would have had a motive to keep Paul Robeson from sitting in Havana, Cuba, with Castro when they try the Bay of Pigs. He lands in Moscow looking fine, lecturing, singing a little bit. All of a sudden,
He cut his wrists. And one could see the scars. But he never talked about it.
they found him early enough so that he didn't bleed severely enough to be in danger. He recovered rapidly under the Soviet doctor's recommended treatment. His story was that there was a wild party in his chambers. To this day, I believe that it would have been easy at that party for someone, person unknown, to walk in and drug him. The drug BZ, developed by the CIA under a program called MK Ultra, is designed to make people paranoid and to make them suicidal.
All of the doctors that I talked to said there's no need to look for a conspiracy theory here. Robeson had what is sometimes called a delusional depressive disorder and other times called a bipolar disorder.
It is a myth that he was suffering over the years from the classic cyclic depression. There's no such medical evidence throughout his life, period.
Islander came from London and stayed there with him. That memory of him sitting in his room with Islander next to him and Islander saying, "Now we must do our exercises, Paul." And my heart broke. It was so sad. But he recouped from that well enough to go back to London with her.
In London, he started to deteriorate within days. He winds up in the Priory Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital on the edges of London. Without consulting the Soviet doctors, these folks in the Priory started him on electroshock within 36 hours of his admission, which over time ballooned to 54 electroshock treatments, which is outrageous by any standards then or now.
On the advice of physician friends, disturbed by his condition and treatment, Paul leaves the Priory and flies to East Berlin. There he is admitted to the Buch Clinic, and his health improves.
When he came back to retire in 1963, we all went to the airport.
Just say how you feel to be back in the country.
Very glad to be back.
Clear the aisle, please. What are you going to do now, Mr. Robeson?
I'm going to be resting for a while.
Robeson, how do you feel about the civil rights movement here? Do you take any activity, any part in the civil rights movement at all?
I've been a part of that all my life.
I read the article in the paper the next day. There's no resemblance to what he said.
We'll get together one day.
He had come back, recovered part way enough to do some small-scale public appearances, to write some articles, once again to be a factor.
There were levels on which the health issues impacted his capacities. He certainly got depressed.
He says, what would an old Paul Robeson do? There's a committee form, get Paul Robeson. There's a picket line, get Paul Robeson. Now he says, I can't see myself doing that as an old man. And if I can't be Paul Robeson, I will retire.
Essie became ill. She had cancer, but she was a person who really couldn't admit to her frailty in any way.
She was an extraordinarily brave woman. Toward the end, knew it was terminal and decided to keep that news from Paul, and indeed from almost everybody, because she wanted Paul to be spared. Essie did a lot of that throughout her life, trying to protect and spare Paul.
Paulie took an apartment and fixed up a room for him, but the whole experiment didn't work.
It was not the best arrangement, and actually through that whole time, the Sister Marion kind of kept agitating that he should come and live in Philadelphia.
They continued surveillance in Philadelphia, and even when he was in the hospital in Philadelphia, including during his last illness.
There were times when he just didn't want to deal, and other times when he did, and he made those choices.
I absolutely never heard him say, gee whiz, they won't even give me credit, or they're not sitting at my feet.
He definitely appreciated and understood the power of all that he accomplished in his life and what he represented for people. He was able to live and see the world catch up with him, validate the very things that he had been persecuted for and hounded for.
Ebony prints the list 10 greatest black men in America. He said, Paul, look at this. He thought about it for a while. And then he said, well, Pop would have been proud. After all these years, he's still the child, bringing home the report card.
He said the reason I'm just putting in time and haven't departed, in other words, haven't ended it all, which I would, if left to myself, have done long ago. Well, there's my family, there's your kids, there's you and your wife, and then there's my public, both here and all over the world. I can't leave that way. And then he got up, and I can still see his sort of bent over a little bit, his back going up the stairs. That was, in a sense, when I buried him, when I cried, when I knew he's gone.
During the viewing, when he had passed, and there was a public viewing at Benta's funeral home in Harlem, I just sat in the back the whole time and watched this parade of humanity come through and pay their last respects. From the numbers runner on the corner to the King of Sweden.
Everywhere in the world, he was known and revered. Well, we must know him, and we must revere him.
The picture I have of him, because I do have a picture, the hands crossed in front of him, the bigness of stature, and the smile that was as big as he was, you know. And then all of these young men around him. My image of that picture is a Christmas tree, and he is the tree, and we are the ornaments. And that's what I felt about him, that what he had done and the trails that he had blazed at least showed us some things about where to go or the consequences of going up this route or another route. And Paul was that.
Paul was a man with 1,000 pockets. And not even Paul knew what was in every pocket. He was one of the giants of the century. Multi-talented, multi-dimensional, willing to jeopardize his own privileges and career in order to help those less fortunate. He was a giant.
The people who leave footprints in the sands of time are the people who teach and inspire. Paul was an inspirer.
If he were to come back at this very moment, he would assess and he'd evaluate where the losses are, where the victories have been, and how to regroup and how to get on, because the enemy is still there.
Every time I feel the spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Now every time I feel the spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. On the mountain my Lord spoke, out his mouth came fire and smoke. Now every time I feel the spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. On the mountain my Lord spoke.
Paul Robeson, Here I Stand, is available on home video cassette for $24.95 plus $4.95 shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.
Every time I feel the spirit moving in my heart, I will pray.
Exclusive corporate sponsorship provided by American Century Investments. American Masters is made possible by the support of the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television, and by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding for American Masters has been provided by and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
We are PBS.
It brutalizes you. You start in to be a man, but you become a machine.
The labor movement.
Show me the country in which there are no strikes. I will show you that country in which there is no liberty.
It's the hammer of justice.
Next time on Freedom. Working for freedom and yearning to breathe free.
The welcome to immigrants.
I'm Katie Couric. Join me for Freedom, a history of us.
Tonight, beginning at 7 on 13.
Join 13 for discounts at museums when you think art, at concert halls when you think music, at performing spaces when you think dance, at centers for learning when you think science, at parks and zoos when you think nature, at fun-filled havens when you think kids.
On February 22nd and 23rd, the American Museum of the Moving Image pays a two-night tribute to the cinematic genius of Wim Wenders with a showing of his Paris, Texas. The Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut continues its exhibition on the joys of collecting art through April the 13th. There's a 2-for-1 admission when you show your member card. The National Academy of Design Museum has the first New York area show devoted to American artist Edwin Dickinson. Dreams and Realities remains on view through April the 13th.
For membership information and more member card discounts, visit our website at 13.org.
This war with Hitler is misguided.
On the next episode of Foyle's War.
He's a pro-Nazi, anti-war, anti-Semitic.
It's a shame someone didn't shoot him.
Perhaps they tried.
Politics and murder don't mix.
I don't care what you think, Mr. Foyle, of me or of my politics, but someone took a shot at me. It's your job to find out who.
ExxonMobil Masterpiece Theater presents Michael Kitchen in Foyle's War.
Tonight at 9 on 13.
If you love 13 on the air, join us on the web. Log on, explore, get more out of 13. Online, think 13.org.
In their quest to make history, they braved bitter cold, brutal winds, dangerous terrain, and forged a daring new route to Antarctica's highest peak. Told through the voice of John Krakauer, PBS presents Nova, Mountain of Ice.
Tuesday night at 8 on 13.